Really pleased to be here on the campus in Carolina. There's only one, right? And I want to thank the center for sponsoring this, as well as the Hutchins family for sponsoring this lecture series. This is terrific, and it's actually my first presentation at UNC, so I'm kind of excited about that. Thanks to Sally Green as well, who emailed me and invited me to be part of this series. So I'm just going to kind of jump into it. What I'd like to do is to read just a little quote from the introduction in the book, and then talk a little bit about what this book does and what I hope it does, and how I got to be writing about popular culture. I'm going to reference a man named David Cohn, who was a native of Greenville, Mississippi, and he's writing in 1947 about the South and the image of the South. And this is just a little section I have in here. He says, in the minds of outsiders, the South was imbued with qualities that applied to no other region of the country. And he's writing this in 1947, which causes him to conclude, quote, "Men love what they imagine and worship what they create." The South of the American imagination was and still is very often created by the industries of popular media. During the period marked by the rise of mass consumption, those industries produced an image of the South that contributed to perceptions of the region as the custodian of America's pastoral traditions. It was portrayed as a place where those traditions still had meaning and where Americans, if they ventured south, might get to experience the Dixie of their dreams. The book I wanted to write, and it took me a while to figure it out, but when I did, it was a book I wanted to write was about the imagined South. A South that people, everyday people, encountered in all aspects of their lives. Historians have been nibbling around the edges of popular culture. Jack Kirby first did it back in 30 years ago with a book called Media Made Dixie. But no one kind of took it up after that, really. Only recently have we seen historians try to take a little, bite out of popular culture. And with this book, I decided to make a whole meal of it. Why should, people in literature and media studies have all the fun? Right? Historians should get in on the act as well. And what it meant for me as a scholar is that I had to change my perspective and look at the South from outside of the South. And so this book looks at the period of the rise of mass consumer society, where we see the emergence of modern advertising, the development of new technologies like film and radio. Mass distribution of goods on a scale hadn't been seen before. And it looks at this period then from the late 19th century through World War II. And within these mass mediums, you have an image of the South that's very much romanticized. It's a nostalgic South. It's a South that, that represents America for a lot of people, the America before industrialism, before urbanization, before modernity. It's not like Southerners didn't have these same kind of images themselves about the South, about the Old South. But it was interesting to me that it was the media, the industries of mass media, of popular culture, that existed outside of the region that really invested in, perpetuated, marketed, disseminated, and ultimately benefited financially from using these images of the South in various mediums of popular culture. So advertising agencies on Madison Avenue, book publishers and music publishers in New York, nationally syndicated radio programs that came out of New York or Chicago, the film industry in Hollywood, which also, by the way, maintained offices in New York, so they knew what the next great book or play was coming out that they should turn into a film. So there's certainly negative repercussions about this. It locks the South in time, in the past, as a region that hasn't progressed much beyond the Old South. But even worse for African Americans, a lot of the black stereotypes in popular culture were based in Southern stereotypes of the mammy and the uncle. And it ultimately hurts the cause of civil rights nationally in the period before World War II. And there was a journalist named Claude Barnett who founded the American Negro Press, said that these kinds of images in popular culture were damaging to the morale of African Americans everywhere. And so while some of this we're going to go through is kind of fun, it wasn't fun for everybody. I'm going to take you sort of on a journey through this with me and talk to you about how I got here to write a book like this, and then share with you some of the things that I've found along the way. Of course, you heard that I wrote a book about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So how do I get from the United Daughters of the Confederacy to writing about movies and advertising and things like that? Well, part of it had to do with this. When I was doing my research on the UDC book, I had to examine the Confederate Veteran magazine. And in the backs of the magazine were these advertisements, all for Confederate culture. It made sense. Confederate statues, the handsome picture of Robert E. Lee, the books, the songs of the Confederacy, uniforms for veterans to return and dress in uniform to the reunions. But if you take a closer look to see where these items are made, you'll see they're not all being made in the South, primarily outside of the South. Okay, and so I thought, well, I could have written this book, and I think I started to write a book about branding Dixie and this idea of an extension of the book that I had written. But then I said, I think there's more to the story here. It's a much bigger story than that, and more importantly, I didn't want to continue to work on the lost cause. So, if you were looking in popular culture, and there's a range of images that you would find across a range of types, but it would be very consistent across the different mediums of popular culture. So whether it was literature, whether it was popular music, the movies, advertising, the postcard in the center of the cotton picking, children's literature even, you would see basically the South locked into this box, and the box is marked Old South. And in there is, the mammy, the uncle figure, the Southern belle, the gentleman. Cotton is a big icon, and then of course the plantation mansion, which is always the big house with white columns. So if I were to take just one of those icons, the mammy, okay, you would see her across the mediums of popular culture. So you would find her in advertising, popular music, on the radio. That's just an advertisement for a radio show, Beulah, which was voiced by a white man. The film, and then in the movies, and then in literature, in children's literature at that. So what you would see is it was a consistency across all these mediums of popular culture, so that's the image that people are coming into contact with in their everyday lives. So I wanted to start maybe just to give you an example of how this might have worked. So here's an advertisement for Aunt Jemima pancake mix. And I know a number of you probably know the story of Aunt Jemima, that the character of Aunt Jemima first emerged at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. A black woman named Nancy Green, who was a domestic from Chicago, portrayed her at the World's Fair, and it was such a success that they sold thousands of boxes of the pancake mix, right? And the woman Nancy Green ended up having a career for the next 20 years playing Aunt Jemima at different kinds of fairs and things, and doing basically the same thing. Well, when the J. Walter Thompson Agency basically became the advertising agency for the brand, they developed another story about Aunt Jemima for women's magazines. And this is an image from a Ladies' Home Journal. And in their telling of the story, Aunt Jemima actually was, they could created another story that she was from a Louisiana plantation, that her pancake mix was all the other mammies were jealous of her throughout the South because of her pancake mix. And one of the things that they did was they hired Arthur Burdett Frost, who you wouldn't know by name, but you would know Uncle Remus Tales and Joel Chandler Harris, and he had illustrated those tales originally. So the agency would go out and hire like the best artists for their particular product, and they hired him, and this is the image he developed, and it was the very first image that went on the box of Aunt Jemima pancake mix. But again, this was something that was completely a fabrication of Madison Avenue. And this particular type of advertising with all the text on it was called tableau advertising, which it told a story. And it was meant to make you feel like this was a real person and draw you into the product. They took Aunt Jemima when radio became, available, this new technology, radio, and they began to advertise it on the radio. And you'll know that all early radio shows had corporate sponsors. You almost couldn't survive on the radio without one. And so they had a little series called Aunt Jemima Radio that first went on the air in I think it was 1931 or 32, but it first went on the air on the Pacific Coast. It was played, Aunt Jemima on the radio was played by a series of white women because black women were not allowed to be actors and actresses. They could perform, they could sing, be entertaining, but they weren't allowed to act. And so the person who first played Aunt Jemima on the radio was Tess Gardella, who was an Italian-American actress from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And she was so, felt so tied to her role that if you see on the picture to the right, when she was buried, she is buried as Aunt Jemima. And I'm going to try to play this clip, and hopefully you can hear it. This is Harriet Widmer, who was from Mississippi and was the last of the women to play Aunt Jemima on the radio. And I'm going to play this clip.
And here's a topping for Aunt Jemima's that makes your butter go just about twice as far. It's maple syrup butter.
Tell the ladies how to fix it.
Well, it just whips together 1/2 a cup of softened butter and 1/2 a cup of maple syrup. Beat till it's light and fluffy as can be. Chill and then serve on Aunt Jemima pancakes or waffles.
And ladies, for those luscious Aunt Jemimas, it's the red box for pancakes and waffles, the yellow box for buckwheat. Get both today. And remember,
Pancake days is happy days.
when you serve tempting, appetizing, taste and tantalize Aunt Jemima pancakes.
One of the things about Pan Alley music and the kinds of songs that came out about the South is that they had a revival on the radio, and as you could see there. Popular music about the South, we could go back to talking about Stephen Foster and Daniel Decatur Emmett's song Dixie. And then in the late 19th century, we have coon songs in which you see African Americans portrayed in derogatory ways, using the term coon, which is a derogatory term as well. But this was some of these images would often have images of black Southerners, and it was very popular music in the late 19th century. As you can see, over 600 coon songs were written in the 1890s alone, there's a lot going on there in terms of the 1890s in the American South and nationally. Those types of songs, though, gave way to Dixie songs in between 1900 and 1920s. And I'd like to read you just a little selection of what I'm talking about. There were hundreds and hundreds of songs about Dixie or about states in the South. And what's interesting about it is who wrote them and performed them. Jewish immigrants who were pounding out a living in New York's Tin Pan Alley and with few exceptions had never been to the places that were the subject of their songs, wrote nearly all of them. I want to be in Dixie, all aboard for Dixieland. I guess I'll soon be back in Dixieland. I love the name of Dixie. Everybody's crazy over Dixie. Anything is nice. If it comes from Dixieland, Dixie Lullaby, and Dixie Girls Are Good Enough for Me are just a brief overview of the Dixie titles. Southern states, too, provided fodder for Tin Pan Alley songsters. I'm going back to Alabama, compliments. I'm going back to Carolina, on the Mississippi, down Kentucky way, memories of Virginia, and everything is peaches down in Georgia. And the character of Mammy also appears in song titles like Carolina Mammy, I Want My Mammy, Mammy's Little Coal Black Rose, and Mammy's Shuffling Dance. And you look at the image on this one of Carolina Mammy, that's Tess Gardella once again. Probably the most famous of the Dixie tunes was that written by Jack Yellen, called Are You From Dixie? And I'm sure you could go on YouTube and find a lot of different people performing this song. And I'm going to play a little bit, and hopefully it'll... Jack Yellen is interesting. Jack Yellen was a Polish Jew who moved to Buffalo, New York, who immigrated to Buffalo, New York, went to school at the University of Michigan, came back to Buffalo, worked as a journalist, and decided to get in on this music, this game, you know, playing. And he wanted to write songs, and he went to Tin Pan Alley, and he wrote Are You From Dixie? And that's how he got his start, and this was one of his most successful songs. But he's also more famous probably for writing the songs Ain't She Sweet and Happy Days Are Here Again. But he got started writing the Dixie songs. The South on the radio is something that I explore in this book, from things about radio minstrelsy to the types of shows. There's an actual radio show called Showboat in the middle. And you begin to see the emergence of Hillbilly South on the radio. Obviously the most successful show of all time was Amos and Andy, which was definitely a minstrel act. And in the story that they told in a book, when they tell the story of how of Amos and Andy, they write about basically about the Great Migration, that they were from Birmingham, Alabama, and they migrated to the north. But their type of performance ended up in a lot of copycat duos, copycat minstrel duos, and I'm going to share with you one of those because, and radio minstrelsy was being performed everywhere, but Mac and Moran were also known as the Two Black Crows. Now the thing about, of course, about radio minstrelsy is these are publicity shots. You would never obviously see that they were Black or African American, but you would know that they were by their speech, and this is what passed off as Black dialect.
All aboard for Natchez, Cairo, and St. Louis. that black smoke coming out that chimney. I bet that old fireman is busy. Doggone, seem like every time there's an excursion, I'm always broke. Yeah, and you wouldn't be broke if you'd go to work. Well, I would work if I could find any pleasure in it. Well, I don't know anything about pleasure, but boy, always remember that the early bird catches a worm. The early bird catches what worm? Why, any worm. Well, who cares about that?
So you
Everybody
can see
knows
it's just
the
like
early
a
bird
really
catch-
sort of dragging out the speech and talking about and perpetuating this idea of laziness among blacks. You know, I would work if I found any pleasure in it. There were on the radio acts that I refer to as radio Southern Belles, and not because that there was anything that they did in particular that made them Southern Belles, but the fan magazines, the radio fan magazines like Radio Star, would portray Southern acts as Southern Belles, these Southern women. So you have the Pickens sisters from Macon, Georgia, who were known for singing Negro spirituals. Irene Beasley, known as the long, tall gal from Dixie, and then the Boswell sisters, who were from New Orleans. And what I learned recently at the American Jazz Museum in Kansas City, that the oldest one was actually born in Kansas City. They take pride in that before the family moved to New Orleans, and so. But they are known for being from New Orleans. And one of the things I learned in the Jazz Museum was that that Ella Fitzgerald got her start by singing the songs of the Boswell sisters. And I'm going to play you a clip, and if you listen to it, you can kind of hear that kind of quick and even a little bit of scat in it.
Crazy people, crazy people like me, go crazy old people like you. Stupid people, damn people like me, go crazy over things you do. While we are underneath the moon above, you've got me acting just like a loony, it must be love, we love. Crazy people like me, go crazy old people like you. Crazy people like you. Crazy people like things to do when we are under the moon.
I've become a fan after learning about them. And I saw and I found a place on the YouTube where someone was going to do a documentary on the Boswell sisters, which they're still trying to raise money for, and I thought I'd send in some myself if they would put one out. We all, probably would reference Gone with the Wind if we wanted to talk about the one thing, if we would pick one thing that had such an influence on people's imaginations about what the South was like. But even before Gone with the Wind came out as a book in 1936 and then the film in 1939, there were lots of films out that were focused on the American South and particularly the Old South. From the very first, one of the earliest films when they were just beginning to make films, the South served as a location, and particularly the Old South served as a location for films. The most successful film, silent film, Birth of a Nation, begins this, and then you get into film, films, what they call the talkies, and then the South again continues to play a role in terms of the location of where these films are being made. Over there on the left is Al Jolson in a short film called A Plantation Act. One of the things I was fortunate to do is go into a film archive, Photo Fest in New York that has a lot of film stills available, and so I found things that I didn't know that had existed before. But you can see it was, even before the book came out, even through film, and that people's appetite had been whetted for something like Gone with the Wind. It was already there. Of course, the book itself was the thing that kind of sets things off, and I talk about this in the book about Gone with the Wind and Margaret Mitchell and And I can't help but feel a little bit sorry for Stark Young, who wrote So Red the Rose only a couple of years before. It was the big plantation novel, and they made it into a movie, but no one remembers him, after Margaret Mitchell came on the scene and in the film. One of the things about that is that every studio in Hollywood wanted the rights to this movie. And I see the letters in Macmillan Publishing, records in New York, everyone, RKO and others, MGM, but it ended up with David Selznick. But that didn't stop Hollywood from going into production with other movies that were set in the Old South to try to ride the coattails of Gone with the Wind, and one of which was Jezebel, that came out just the year before with Bette Davis as the star, and she won an Oscar for that. Gone with the Wind was really the first blockbuster film. It's like the film that, the first film that really kind of takes advantage of the marketing part of what films do today. We take that for granted today. A movie comes out and there's all sorts of toys being sold attached to, say Harry Potter or whatever. But Gone with the Wind is kind of that first film that has this going on, and David Selznick and the studio, they ended up signing like 75 different agreements for products related to Gone with the Wind. And this is some of the goods and images of the goods and advertising that I came across. Over to the far left is an ad for Macy's, and it was entitled, part of this was called The Old South Comes North. And essentially Macy's set up rooms and set up window displays based on the Gone with the Wind theme, and said, please come down to see this because it's better than a Broadway show. Then you have Old South toiletries in the advertising, again, the Southern Belle, playing up, again, inspired by Gone with the Wind. At Saks Fifth Avenue, they were selling something called the carpet bag. And then the biscuits, it says, just as you enjoyed the Old South and Gone with the Wind, you'll like our biscuits. Where they're aristocrats of biscuits, which was at a Boston store chain. And then, the New York distributors of Southern Comfort came up with an advertisement for the Scarlett O'Hara cocktail, no more than 2 lest you be gone with the wind. I actually had to try this, if I was doing my research. Southern Comfort cranberry juice and a squeeze of lime. It's very sweet. And as I was saying to Sally, and that wouldn't really say, that's not like Scarlett. Scarlett was not sweet, but she said maybe it was the lime, the tart lime. Other types of Old South advertising, again, another Old South perfumers. I like him because the Old South perfumers were located on Fifth Avenue in New York. Avon did some ads during World War II about women, and they used Southern backdrops, and the idea is, sort of that Southern women kind of represent the ideal of American femininity, and that you should model yourself sort of after them, and so you can see a lot of this. This is the part that's fun for me, and it's kind of related to the next book on tourism that I'm editing. But how does the South respond? If this is all out here, are they feeling bad about it? Or, well, no, they're going to capitalize on it. This is a very early ad for the Biloxi Chamber of Commerce, probably known as someone might call the Redneck Riviera, but before it was more like the American Riviera in Biloxi. And you can see this advertisement, and if you look at it to see where the arrows are going, it's sort of reaching out to places in through the Northeast and the Midwest. And it said, the reason to come here, of course, is to escape the harsh winters, but also because, there were other, like the Biloxi Rogue and Horseshoe Club memberships. And they're saying, so what would these types of advertisements would be sent out into the Northeast. But again, kind of an idea of hospitality. There were state tourism campaigns. These I just brought a couple here. Virginia's brochure in the 1930s. This is from a railroad company, and refers to Virginia as the land of romance, which I think predates, Virginia is for lovers. And then the Mississippi's advertising campaign, which there was an actual branch of government in Mississippi that was organized in the mid-30s called the Mississippi Advertising Commission, and they came up with a plan to try to reach tourists and bring them into Mississippi. Part of it had to do with the fact that they had had great success with the Natchez pilgrimage of their antebellum homes. But you can see in this, under the Mississippi side, the advertisement was placed in newspapers throughout the Northeast and the Midwest, and welcoming welcoming the nation to Mississippi with a Southern belle opening the door, welcoming them. And they also sent out images like the one at the bottom right from Natchez of a Southern belle at a big plantation, again to encourage people to come and tour. Another, and just so I can give you a little background, and if you're not familiar with the Natchez pilgrimage, it began in 1932, and it started, and it was an effort to, sort of raise a little money, have people tour the homes. There are many antebellum mansions in Natchez. A woman named Catherine Miller had invested in these glass, what they call lantern slides, kind of slides that show that and she would take these on the road with her throughout the country and present these slides, and she would be dressed in in a hoop skirt and the like, and be the Southern belle. And then you have these images of Southern belles and the mansions and the Spanish moss and all the sorts of things people were found exotic about the South. So she took that on the road, and within a few years, thousands of people started coming. By 1940, and probably also building on the success of Gone with the Wind, Natchez was a place where you could see mansions that actually looked like that, what they had seen in the film. Natchez was only a city of maybe 13,000 people, and then 1940, 50,000 people came to do the pilgrimage. Even when Mississippi didn't have very good roads. And it was one of the things, tourism is one of the things that helped spur southern states to actually build roads. You've got to get them there. So the Natchez pilgrimage was instrumental in that. I found this because this was kind of interesting to me. This was just from a newspaper, and the women is a garden club from Jefferson City, Missouri. But Mrs. Miller had been to visit them, and now they were going to be tourists. They were going back after she had visited them, showed them the slides. They decided to go see these mansions and tell more people about it back in their state. I closed my book because at the end of World War II, just sort of right before the beginning of television. Movies obviously were the most influential form of popular media up until television. And the advent of television and also the civil rights movement, I think, really changed the way people began to look at the South. Amos and Andy's now on television, it's not the radio. Now you see this, and there's somehow a different reaction to seeing them behave and talk in the way that they do on television. More people get involved in reacting to it, not just the NAACP or African American journalists, but whites as well. Also, black soldiers serving in Korea wrote letters protesting Amos and Andy because there they were serving their country and then being maligned in their eyes back home on television. And then, of course, the civil rights movement, and seeing that on television offered people a far different picture of the South that they had known before. So it wouldn't be to say that these sort of, the romantic images didn't continue, but they began to definitely begin to change, and new stereotypes of the South emerge. You'll still have Southern belles come back in the form of designing women in the 1980s, and even this past year in a form of a commercial for Butterfinger Snackers, two Southern belles arguing over their candy. But anyway, I end the story here. I know there's an opportunity to write a new book if I wanted to do a second half, but instead what I decided to do was start a blog called Pop South, in which I write about the South in popular culture and more contemporary ways in which the South is being portrayed. All right, thank you for listening.